I opened the door because the thought of not knowing had become a weight I could no longer carry, and the first sight that met me tightened something in my chest into a single, sharp point of disbelief. She was there, hair loose and shoulders bare in the lamplight, laughing at something he had said with a sound that used to be private between us. And he was close enough that the casual placement of his hand at the small of her back read, less like professional courtesy and more like an ordinary claim that had been practiced into habit. I stood for a long second in the threshold and did not speak because there was a clarity to that instant that would have been lost in noise, and the last thing I wanted was for the scene to be rearranged by my own temper into melodrama I might later regret. I did not shut the door or burst in. Instead, I watched the little choreography of proximity and ease and made a decision that felt cold and necessary. I would not give them the spectacle they expected. I would not hand him the drama that let him say later, with a theatrical sigh, that I had been unreasonable. Because his power had always depended on optics, and I was determined to change the game to one where records mattered more than rhetoric. In the days that followed, I moved like a man learning to use tools I had ignored. A legal pad became my ledger. My eyes learned to catalog receipts and times rather than the shape of her smile, and I began to collect small, banal things that add up to revelations. A hotel charge time-stamped on a night she said she was home, a calendar entry labeled as a client meeting that placed her in a different town, the boss's car leaving a building before dawn with a license plate I photographed while pretending to be an anonymous passerby. The work of cataloging was a strange relief because anger without evidence is only heat, and heat cools quickly. Method, documentation, chain of custody. These were the languages that turned rumor into record and grief into correction. I set rules for myself like a surgeon sets sterile boundaries. No illegal hacks, no public shaming for sport, no grandstanding on social media, and only facts that could be shown in a room with auditors and lawyers present. It was not glamorous, but it was durable. I found an unlikely small ally in an assistant whose job it was to keep order in calendars, and over 2 coffees and a lot of quiet questions, she slipped me a harmless-looking export that made a pattern emerge where before there had only been fragments. Meetings that conveniently aligned with personal receipts, expense lines described in euphemisms, and a cadence of cover stories that read like choreography. There were moments that cut into me differently. The memory of the way her hand once fit into mine, the strange physical pull that flared briefly when I saw her close up, and then recoiled, because that same pull reminded me how easily desire can be used to blind someone to the ledger of truth. And I kept those sensations under strict control because they were distractions I could not afford. I spoke once, quietly, to a lawyer not to start a war, but to learn the exact levers that turn private hurt into public process, because I wanted any disclosure to be immune to the easy dismissal of sour grapes. Each small confirmation I wrote down felt like laying a stone into the foundation of an argument that could no longer be wished away. And by the time I realized the next step needed to be taken, I had transformed from a man carrying a small, hot grievance into someone whose intent was not to humiliate for pleasure, but to insist on an accounting. I would collect the proof. I would present it where it could not be ignored. And I would let systems of audit and law do the work that theatrics could not. After the doorway, I stopped asking why and started asking how. And that small change turned a man with a raw chest into someone who could be patient enough to build a case. Because anger lightens into work when you give it measurements. And I set to work on lists, timestamps, and receipts the way a carpenter measures twice and cuts once. I knew theatrics would only feed his power to accuse me of instability. And so I decided any action I took would be surgical and documented. I learned to read the ordinary as if it were testimony. A restaurant bill on a corporate card when she said she was home. A taxi receipt timestamp during a meeting she swore she attended. Calendar invites that shifted subtly, as if rehearsed for coincidence. And I photographed license plates from the curb with the steady hands of a man who had decided that proof is the truest revenge. And I archived emails, exported calendar data, cross-checked expense line descriptions with public event schedules, and I organized the files into a simple chronology that made a messy life begin to look like a pattern. I used a burner number to confirm logistics rather than to provoke drama, because I did not want to be the person who ruined a life for the momentary satisfaction of confrontation. A single well-phrased message brought back a reply that used a private shorthand I had heard in voicemail fragments, and which suddenly linked two calendar entries I'd thought unrelated, and there were moments of dissonant, dangerous attraction when I watched her laugh across a table with him and felt a familiar rush that I checked like a fever because acknowledging desire would have made me soft, and I could not afford softness when building a case required clarity. The unexpected turn came when her assistant, a woman more concerned with neatness than loyalty, slid me a calendar export over coffee as if it were nothing, and the export carried a string of recurring entries with a name that set my teeth on edge. Mark. A name I had heard before at parties, but never in internal memos, and now it appeared in notes, in expense descriptions, and in the fine print of vendor emails in a way that suggested coordination rather than coincidence. And seeing that name across multiple documents felt like stumbling on a thread in a sweater that, when pulled, might reveal a larger whole. So I copied the files onto a secured drive and labeled them with a date, because chain of custody was not paranoia but prudence. I met a lawyer and spoke only in facts, and he taught me the exact procedures that turn private records into official questions rather than angry accusations. We agreed on rules: no leaks, no illegal methods, and protection for anyone who would corroborate my files. And the protocol made the work feel less like payback and more like a duty. And as I copied another stack of exported emails into a secured folder that evening, I found a payment confirmation from a vendor I did not recognize with a transfer note that included Mark's name as approver. And that single line shifted my frame from personal betrayal to something wider and financial. So I closed my laptop with the slow care of a man who knows a match can burn a house and whispered, not with triumph, but with measured resolve, "This is where I start." The plan stopped feeling like a fever and started feeling like a job the night the assistant slid a neatly printed export across the table and said, in a voice that tried very hard to sound as if she were ordering coffee rather than confessing to patterns, "I'm only showing you this because the numbers annoyed me, not because I want to be involved." And when I unfolded that paper, the neat columns read like a slow-motion unmasking. Dinners marked as client at midnight, hotel folios that matched the mileage she'd claimed as errands, and recurring calendar entries that, when stitched together, mapped a choreography of proximity that no honest coincidence could explain. From then on, I moved like someone learning a craft, not an avenger. I photographed license plates from my car as if they were specimens. I copied email headers and saved attachments with names that meant nothing to a layman and everything to someone who knew how often truth hides behind nomenclature. And I began to trace the money as one traces a scent, patient and pragmatic. There were moments that felt dangerous in ways I had not expected. Once, watching her cross the street with the boss a little too close, a memory of simpler tenderness flickered, how her hand used to fit into mine, and in the same instant a sharper calculation arrived, because desire had to be translated into discipline if it was not to become a liability. That small, stubborn physical pull I felt when she laughed near him was cataloged like any other evidence, noticed, and then set aside so the ledger would not be ruined by sentiment. I recruited a single ally who did not want drama, only order, and she talked at length in the sort of careful, almost weary cadence people use when they are unloading weight they have carried alone. I started flagging these because the invoices never matched the notes, because I was asked to reconcile things that didn't reconcile by accident, she said. And she gave me names and attachments and a list of vendor emails that suddenly made the pattern uglier and larger than an affair. There were transfers that pinged to shell accounts, approvals signed with initials that matched an inner circle, and references to Mark that had once sounded innocuous at a party now repeating through threads with the sick rhythm of coordination. I used a burner phone to send a non-accusatory, carefully worded message that elicited the private shorthand I'd heard in a voicemail fragment months earlier, and the reply tightened two separate calendar entries into a single premeditated plan. The method was surgical: no threats, no public rants, only tiny, undeniable alignments that a compliance officer could follow with a spreadsheet. When I met my lawyer, I spoke in records and dates and refused to let my voice harden into spectacle, and he answered in rules and next steps in a long, exacting sentence about process and protections that made me feel oddly steadier. We'll secure chain of custody. We'll avoid leaks that could be spun as malice. and we'll present the facts in a way that invites investigation rather than condemns you in the court of popular opinion," he said, and hearing that calm procedure reminded me that systems, once engaged, are more dangerous to a man who depends on charm than any single dramatic revelation could be. There were close calls, an intercepted message that vanished before I could archive it, a junior employee who grew pale when the boss called him into a room, a receipt that I almost let go of because it implicated someone I still liked, but each time the rules I'd set for myself pulled me back. No illegal entry into accounts, no fabricated evidence, and an insistence on protecting anyone who might corroborate the documents, because exposing the ledger without shielding witnesses would have been a selfish act that could harm people who had been trapped in this longer than I had. And through it all, the presence of Mark's name kept surfacing in small, maddening ways. The groom's name tucked into memos, initials on approvals, someone's offhand reference at a staff party that suddenly read like a map, and every reappearance was a small, galvanizing click in the machine I had started to build, until the distant shape of the thing I was up against resolved into something concrete and enormous enough that it demanded a strategy beyond personal ruin. It demanded exposure that would force accounting, not revenge for its own sake, and that thought, cold and exacting, steadied my hand as if I were settling into a new trade. I picked a Tuesday because ordinary routines hide the movements of men who intend to unsettle a system without making noise, and I started the day with a discipline that had replaced the knotted fury of the first weeks. The packet was assembled with surgical care and a calm that had nothing to do with triumph and everything to do with making a record that could not be dismissed as a tantrum. I printed the timeline, stapled the most telling emails to the front, labeled screenshots with short notes, and included a concise cover letter that asked for a formal review rather than publicity, because process strips charm of power. I copied everything to 2 encrypted drives so the leverage would be secure before it was used. The first recipient was an investor contact who had once asked me a pointed question at a conference and had surprised me by valuing accuracy over optics, and my message was measured. I attached the packet, offered context, and asked if they would consider a compliance review, and the response came in a polite, efficient email that said they would pass it to their compliance team, which was the exact kind of quiet engine I needed moving in the background. At the same time, I reached out to a careful reporter I trusted and provided a narrower dossier that focused on documentary anomalies rather than on revenge, and he agreed to hold publication while regulators were given time to act, because a journalist who values credibility will not squander an investigation on sensation. The choice to involve him was tactical, not theatrical, and when he asked for dates and supporting documents, I sent them with the same restraint I had used assembling the packet. Internally, I tightened protections for the people who had quietly helped me, advising them to preserve communications and to forward any requests to a secure address, and I arranged legal counsel for a colleague who had received an intimidating visit the night before. Because exposing a pattern of misconduct requires protecting those whose evidence can make the difference between rumor and revelation, and because I refused to make heroes of people I would allow to be sacrificed. The boss sensed the pressure. He began sending curated messages that tried to sound like concern and control, and he called me once with a voice that was practiced concern and contained an implicit threat, saying that airing grievances would have consequences. But I met that call with the calm that comes from having practiced translating hurt into fact. And I responded only with a brief clarification that I wished for an impartial review rather than a spectacle. There were close calls. A receipt a colleague could not locate before I could copy it. A junior staffer who turned white when called into a meeting, and the brief, dangerous pull I felt when I saw her in the lobby that I cataloged and set aside as a distraction, because desire would have been a liability in the ledgered work I had chosen. And every time anxiety rose, I returned to our rules. No illegal methods, no public shaming for sport, and an insistence on protecting witnesses. By late afternoon, I felt the apparatus move, investors opening a compliance thread, a reporter drafting questions, and HR receiving discreet requests for clarification. And the board, confronted with paperwork that would not be soothed by charm, began to answer with documents rather than press statements. And watching accountability creep forward felt less like gloating and more like a recalibration of truth. That night, the journalist called to confirm dates, and the investor asked to schedule interviews. Allies pinged with relief and fear. My sister left a worried voicemail. And alone in my dim kitchen, I named my act for what it was. Not theatrical revenge, but the insistence that the ledger reflect reality, and that insistence would, by morning, have consequences none of us could fully measure. The day I pulled the invoice out of the pile and read the routing memo, the apartment seemed to shrink until the only things that mattered were the lamp, the print, and a single line that refused to be mere coincidence. The vendor name was dull and forgettable on its face, the sort of entry that disappears into bookkeeping. But the routing note included the groom's initials, and the transfer date matched the night she had told me she was home. And when those two details locked together, the pattern I'd been tracing with nights, receipts, and calendar exports snapped into a new clarity. It was not a revelation of melodrama, but of method, layered payments funneled through an unremarkable vendor, approvals signed with initials instead of full names, and timestamps that matched meetings labeled as client calls yet placed people in hotel districts at odd hours. When the personal folded into the financial, my plan had to change because this was no longer purely about betrayal. It was about money that moved in ways that could hurt more than a single marriage, and about a network that used intimacy as camouflage while accounts were rerouted. I sat very still and felt a strange, private ache when a memory of her warmth flickered through my mind. A physical pull that made everything complicated in a way I had to bury because the work I was doing demanded rigor, not drama, and desire had to be cataloged like any other evidence rather than indulged. I redoubled my focus and converted emotion into procedure, tracing wire headers, matching invoice numbers to dates, saving copies of calendar exports, and labeling every file with the who, when, and how so that nothing I produced could be dismissed as angry speculation. I sent a redacted, tightly reasoned packet to the investor contact I had cultivated and to a journalist who valued verification over sensation, and the replies were sober and swift. Compliance would open a thread, auditors might request bank files, and the reporter agreed to hold publication while regulators were allowed to respond. The machinery I had nudged into motion was not theatrical but inexorable. A compliance inbox generated a case number, auditors asked for backups of reconciliations, and an independent investigator requested witness lists, and each procedural step made the groom and the boss answerable to records instead of charm. That did not mean there were no costs. The assistant who had slipped me the export trembled when investigators called and begged for counsel. A junior colleague was put on leave pending interviews and called me from a gas station in the dark to say he felt terrified and relieved at once. And my sister left a voicemail that mixed worry with an unexpected pride I did not know how to accept. There were also quiet restorations. An accountant who had been asked to massage numbers thanked me because the audit returned meaning to her spreadsheets, and a vendor who received a reversal called to demand an explanation and help trace funds back through intermediaries. And in those small, human corrections, I found a form of victory that was cleaner than spectacle. I will not pretend the work felt like pure justice. Some nights I woke with panic as the reporter's draft sat in my inbox and imagined private pain made public. But when auditors began to trace transfers from vendor to shell account, and the groom's initials appeared in internal memos alongside approvals, I felt a sober satisfaction that the ledger was being corrected in a way that mattered more than any headline could. Standing outside the building that evening, I felt no triumphal glee but a complicated relief, because the record, at last, reflected a truth that could no longer be gaslit away, and the reckoning I had engineered, less theatrical than I once imagined, was exactly the kind I had chosen. Process over performance, accountability over revenge. I realized early that the kind of pressure I needed to apply had to be surgical rather than loud, because loudness would let him turn everything into a spectacle, and he was fluent in spectacle. Instead, I aimed at small, precise fractures in the social architecture that supported him: family unease, vendor doubts, and the patient work of compliance officers who respond to documentation more than drama. So I parceled out the packet in pieces, tailoring each share to the person most likely to act. The wedding planner received timing anomalies tied to rehearsal invoices. The bank compliance officer received headers and routing notes that suggested irregular transfers. And a journalist I trusted received a redacted narrative that connected calendar entries to financial traces without any smears. Each outreach was phrased as a professional concern rather than a call to arms. I wanted people to react as professionals. An anonymous line to the planner, "Please recheck vendor confirmations for the rehearsal," wasn't dramatic, but it seeded unease in the groom's inner circle, and unease is brittle and spreads. When the planner called a vendor for confirmation, she received a scanned invoice that contained an approval code matching one of the phantom transfers I had documented. That single cross-check turned suspicion into something an event professional could not ignore. Meanwhile, the compliance officer quietly opened a case after seeing the bank headers and requested backups, which set in motion the kind of quiet scrutiny that doesn't play to charm but to ledgers. I protected the people who helped me. My assistant who'd slipped a calendar export became visibly shaken when a senior partner questioned her access, and I made sure she had counsel and instructions. Preserve everything. Do not respond to pressure. Forward requests to legal. That was the human cost. People fearing the consequences of doing what was right. And I took that cost seriously enough to pay for counsel without question. There were moments when the physical pull I once felt for her flared briefly at an odd angle. The way her hair caught the light in a hallway, the small curve of a smile meant for someone else. And that spark felt dangerous and soft all at once, but I forced it down into a file label because desire would have been a liability in the architecture I was building. Social leverage is a blunt tool unless used precisely, so I also sent a careful, anonymous nudge to the groom's mother with one redacted invoice attached, phrased as maternal concern rather than accusation, because family will prod in private where outsiders cannot. Within days, the mother asked pointed questions at a dinner, and the groom's composure showed hairline cracks that were useful because they forced him to choose between asserting loyalty and answering for documents. My wife texted me a single line, "You'll regret this," and the old ache flickered up at the implied threat, but I logged the message with counsel and kept calm because legal proof is a better shelter than bravado. The week closed with the planner reporting an inconsistency, the compliance officer requesting preliminary records, and an HR whisper that someone had ordered a data pull. The mechanism I had nudged into motion was real now, and with that reality came the knowledge that this would reorder lives. It was not a moment of triumphant revenge so much as an acceptance of responsibility. I had chosen to force accountability, and being the one to light that match meant I had to protect the people who had helped me and keep the exposure as clean as the evidence I had gathered. I had imagined the fight would be with paper, emails, timestamps, and bank headers. But the brittle thing turned out to be people, because when the ledger began to touch livelihoods, courage thinned in places a spreadsheet cannot measure. The assistant who had handed me that calendar export went quiet for days, and when she finally answered my burner, her voice was small and hurried, and she said, "They came by my desk. They checked files. I'm sorry, I can't." And the line fell into a silence that felt heavier than any invoice. Silence like that is not a data point, but a warning that someone fears for rent, reputation, and the quiet things that keep a life upright. And once fear moves through a room, the plan you made on paper needs protection for the people who will carry the truth. I arranged counsel for her without announcements and set clear, unromantic rules. Preserve everything, forward requests to legal, do not answer under pressure, because I would not let frightened people be collateral damage in an attempt to make one man pay. A junior accountant called me from a petrol station shaking. He had been shown reconciliations he did not prepare and asked to sign, and when he whispered, I was told to fix it. His voice folded under the strain of being trusted with a lie. So I found him representation and told him precisely what to save and how to answer questions without volunteering more than the truth required. There are people who counsel patience when the world tilts, and I found one old friend offering bland, measured advice about waiting it out. His distance felt like a buffer thrown up between me and what I needed to know, and I filed that unease away because those who urge slow quiet can sometimes be protecting convenience rather than justice. The first public rupture came at a rehearsal dinner I had been careful to attend only as an observer. I had left a redacted invoice with the planner and sent a discreet note to an older relative of the groom suggesting they double-check vendor confirmations because families talk in ways auditors do not, and small doubts spread quicker by the hearth than they do in a courtroom. The room was warm with lamplight, wine poured liberally, and a polite hum of conversation. I sat toward the back and watched the boss across the table, his laugh too practiced, the groom beside him like a man comfortable in his alliances, and then a terse exchange hardened into argument in a way that none of us had anticipated. The groom rose suddenly, and with emotion that carried years of accumulated grievance, he struck the boss across the face, a hand more shocked than choreography, and the room inhaled as if a gust had knocked the lamps askew. The boss's composed mask shattered into a raw, stunned countenance, and he touched his mouth with a hand that trembled despite his suit. The groom, breathing hard, said in a voice that carried, "You promised me honesty." And those words landed like a verdict, because when family hears accusation, it does not yield to charm as easily as the market does. The rupture did a strange service to the ledger I had been building. A sudden, public outrage forced people in the groom's circle to look at documents they might otherwise have rationalized away, but it also scattered witnesses and created pressure for retraction. So that same night, I checked in with anyone who had been kind enough to speak and made sure legal cover was in place. I noticed, in a stupid human way, a quick prick of the old physical pull when I saw her laugh before the argument, an attraction I logged and then set aside like an irrelevant file, because desire would have been a liability in the work of documentation, and I felt a mix of relief and dread as the groom stormed out and the boss excused himself to a private room. The close call was not a derailment, but an escalation. Momentum had shifted, people were rattled, alliances might fracture, and the next moves needed to be faster, kinder to the frightened, and more precise than anything I had done so far. The betrayal arrived like a paper cut, small at first, then aching deep. The email labeled "For Mike" sat in my inbox like a trivial thing until I opened it and watched the world rearrange itself. It was from the friend I trusted most, the man I'd called at 2 in the morning when suspicion kept me awake, the one whose jokes used to feel like home. The attachment was an email chain threaded with introductions, approvals, and notes that put his name beside approvals I had never expected to see. I did not explode. I backed up the file to my encrypted folder, because the first lesson this whole project had taught me was that fury without chain of custody is just noise. I read the thread slowly, the way a juror reads a contract. Casual phrases like, "Let Mark handle it," notes about vendors being quiet, initials that appeared next to routing numbers. Each small line fit into a pattern I had glimpsed but had not yet understood: sudden accommodations, nudges toward patience, a system where a friend's reassurances lined up with approvals and transfers that now looked anything but accidental. I called him because I wanted an explanation that still sounded human. When he picked up, his voice was the same easy cadence from years of shared jokes. I asked, "Why do these approvals have your initials?" And he laughed too quickly. He offered plausible deniability, logistics, introductions, favors, but the email trail spoke in a language denial could not erase. I listened to him attempt to minimize it, to make his role sound bureaucratic and harmless, and I noticed in his voice the small, steady calm of someone accustomed to steering things behind the scenes. That calm no longer reassured me. It unsettled me. Grief arrived before the fire. There is a particular sorrow when someone converts intimacy into utility. The texts I had kept because they felt like proof of a life became evidence of how thoroughly I had been trusted and then used. I thumbed through our old messages and found nudges toward patience at moments when his own hand was redirecting the board. The warmth of old jokes curdled into clues. Losing him as a friend felt like losing a lamb. A private absence that wasn't about public shame, but about the quiet theft of confidence. I asked to meet in a neutral cafe because private rooms invite theatrics. For a brief minute, we were the old pair trading barbs. Then I slid the printed chain across the table and watched his face change. Deflection, a flash that might have been regret, then the practiced mask of composure. He tried the same moves. You don't know the logistics. I was smoothing friction, and I watched how practiced explanations fell apart when placed beside documents. The paper does its work. Facts demand answers where charm offers only delay. I kept my voice flat and procedural. I photographed the chain, uploaded it to the secure folder, and told him plainly that his entries would be included in the packet I intended to share with auditors and counsel. He made a small, self-interested apology, more about consequence than contrition, and it landed thin. I did not gloat. That was not the point. This had become about completeness, proving how a network used intimacy and trust to camouflage movements of money and approvals. His duplicity expanded the scope of my work and sharpened the stakes. That night, I slept badly, thinking in terms of documents and protection. The ledger I had been building would now bear his name, and that reality required careful steps: who to warn, who to shield, which files to prioritize. The personal wound sat beside a colder resolution. Betrayal by a friend cut differently, but it also clarified the path. I had never wanted to ruin people for spectacle. I wanted the record to reflect reality. His name would be part of that record, and I would make sure it could not be dismissed as rumor or a bitter vendetta. The counterstrike had to feel inevitable and immaculate, like a mechanism wound tight enough to do what I had planned. And that morning I moved pieces into place with the slow confidence of someone who trusts records more than pulse. I instructed my lawyer to prepare a sealed packet with a short executive summary and a strict chronology that began with the hotel folio and ended with routing memos bearing initials I could now read as signatures, and I made sure each copy had a timestamp and a clear chain of custody so no one could call it rumor. I tipped a trusted journalist with a redacted subset focused purely on documentary anomalies rather than on melodrama, and I asked an investor contact to flag compliance quietly. Both replied with the clinical professionalism I had hoped for, the sort of response that turns gossip into formal inquiry. I spent the rest of the morning confirming witness availability and arranging counsel for the people who had helped, because truth demands protection for those who risk speaking it, and I would not accept heroism as an excuse to leave others exposed. On the way to the venue, I checked one last time that the folder on my lap contained the invoices, the calendar exports, the vendor emails, and the bank headers that stitched the pattern together, and I felt neither triumph nor cruelty so much as a sober obligation. Exposing this meant reordering lives, and reordering lives meant I had to make sure the frightened were not the ones crushed by the fall. The ceremony moved forward in its polite choreography, and the boss sat by the groom as if proximity could act as an alibi, and for a brief stupid second a human ache passed through me when I saw her laugh among strangers. I noted that sensation, filed it, and let it cool because desire would have been a liability in the architecture I was building. The first Fisher arrived almost accidentally. A relative at the reception, tipped with a single redacted invoice, mentioned an odd routing number in an offhand toast, and the number landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water so that ripples reached ears that could not ignore them. The groom's face changed as people looked at documents that matched dates and transfers he had been assured were administrative, and the boss's composed smile thinned into something fragile as family members began to ask questions that charm could not answer. Compliance opened formal inquiries, auditors requested reconciliations, and bankers flagged certain transfers for review. The slow machinery of verification moved with a dispassionate force that is crueler than spectacle because it leaves less room for spin. The journalist published a careful piece that morning framed around paper and timestamps rather than gossip, protecting the frightened with redactions while making clear the financial line that linked the groom and the boss. And reading your name beside a transfer in print is quieter and more devastating than any shouted accusation. There were costs. The assistant who had slipped me the calendar export was placed on leave and called me from a parking lot in tears until I secured counsel for her. And a junior accountant who had been asked to sign reconciliations he did not prepare trembled through his first interview with auditors, grateful and terrified in the same breath. So I stayed at the margins of the storm, ensuring people had legal advice and that their testimonies would be handled with care. The friend whose emails had woven approvals into introductions looked at me with a mix of shame and something colder, and the conversation we had afterward was brief and crystalline because the evidence had taken his choreography out of shadow and placed it under light. His denials sounded thin beside printouts and headers, and the voice he had used in messages that matched the approvals. In the days that followed, some doors closed and other doors opened because people respected the way I had translated private hurt into procedural insistence rather than spectacle, and offers that arrived were from those who valued discipline and protection of witnesses rather than headlines. I did not walk away unmarked. The work had cost friendships and quiet comforts, but it had corrected a ledger in ways that made restitution possible, and that left me with a complicated, sober relief. Revenge that was less about spectacle and more about insisting that paper reflect truth. Everything after the article arrived as a series of careful reckonings rather than the cinematic collapse I had once imagined. The board published corrective filings. External auditors requested reconciliations, and a new compliance committee was given authority to review past approvals so that Charm could no longer mask sloppy or dishonest bookkeeping. And the public statements were dry and corporate, while private conversations rearranged livelihoods. The boss was removed from public duties, escorted from the premises, and within weeks his access to accounts was revoked. He spent long days with lawyers and recruiters who no longer sounded interested, and the groom's family fractured as questions moved from whispers into the open. The friend whose emails had smoothed introductions found his role narrowed and his explanations thinner under scrutiny. Reputations that had been built on decades of favors frayed in a way that felt both inevitable and savage, and he retreated from social circles that had once welcomed him without question. My wife vacillated between contrition and defensiveness, sometimes remorseful and brittle, sometimes pleading for our private life to remain private. But the ledger did not care for apologies. What mattered were timestamps and approvals, and when auditors showed her name in routing notes, the professional consequences followed. Projects were reassigned, offers rescinded, and colleagues distanced themselves in a way that left her small and ordinary in a way she had never been before. I met her twice after the public inquiry. We spoke in measured tones about truth, responsibility, and the impossibility of undoing what had been done. And there were moments when the old physical pull flared, an old gesture, a look that used to mean comfort. But attraction was a liability I cataloged and then shelved, because accountability required that I keep sight of facts rather than salvage intimacy. In the months that followed, some people received restitution or improved severance as auditors untangled misspent funds and negotiated clawbacks. And that practical redress mattered to the junior staffers and vendors who had been harmed more than any theatrical exposure ever could. For me, there was no triumphant return to a life unchanged. I took a job with a smaller firm where documentation mattered and where leaders spoke plainly about process. And those rooms rewarded the discipline I had practiced rather than the melodrama I had resisted. The work cost me friendships and quiet comforts, and it left scars that do not make good lines in a story, but it also made possible a correction that otherwise might never have occurred. I do not take pride in the private satisfaction I felt when the records were righted, but I accept it as part of a complicated ledger. In the end, I learned that revenge that feels clean on the tongue is rarely clean in the aftermath, and that insisting on accuracy and protection for people who risked telling the truth was the only kind of retribution I could live with. I had collected proof and, painfully, collected their fall, and the silence that follows is not triumph so much as the steady work of living with what you have chosen.